So welcome all to this afternoon session on the second half of the afternoon session of this the annual Platypus Convention. And thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panelists, and especially thanks, a big shout out to Wentai and Tom Willis, for helping me putting together this event. So the 1970s proved an important caesura for Marxism. In France, for example, where you had Stalin's Communist Party, Marx was read anew, though through the filter of Althusser. Everywhere, there seemed to be Marxist economists and philosophers, and even bourgeois critics of Marxism, who pointed to internal contradictions in Marxist writings, or to their supposedly problematic receptions, starting with the traditional Marxists, such as Engels or Kautsky. This confusion over terminologies, particularly over the first 4 chapters of Capital Volume 1, led German Marxist Hans-Georg Backhaus to reevaluate the entire historical and philosophical debate around Marx, especially theorization of the value form. In face of many of Marx's 20th century critics, Backhaus admitted that, quote, Marxist literature and value theory was indeed incapable of refuting each objection of the other side. Indeed, this Marxist literature is itself not free of great errors of interpretation, and many of its followers are preoccupied in quarreling with each other. Backhaus concludes, quote, this is the depressing result of the debate. Marxist scientists were incapable of defining the meaning of their own value theoretical concepts in a generally binding way, end quote. Backhaus's intervention in this ongoing debate proved to be the starting point for some re-evaluations of Marx in Germany, most notably in value critique, particularly around the journals Krisis and Exit, and the new Marx reading, the most prominent adherent of which is unarguably Michael Heinrich. Those developments also gave a new turn in the political and theoretical orientation of many young activists in Germany, who took up the critical rereading of Marx by the value critics. Value critical notions, such as the call for the abolition of value, or the abolition of proletarian labor, did not remain limited to Germany, however. The now defunct British blog Principia Dialectica began to translate articles from Krisis, and in the United States, some of these developments in Marxist scholarship were introduced to leftist discourse through Moishe Stone's writings, who had spent several years in Germany during the 1970s, mega-CDs. However, the at times autonomous or situationist activists who refer to value critique as their influence bring up the question, again, of the role of the political and reformist approaches to politics, while they themselves argue, following thinkers such as Norbert Frankl of Krisis, that many of the traditional categories of revolutionary politics of traditional Marxism are quote-unquote infected by capitalism and thus need the establishment of a kind of outside to the persisting reality. More orthodox Marxists, such as Wolfgang Fritz Hau, bemoan the near complete abandonment of the dialectical emphasis on class struggle. Thus, value critique and its many young followers are continually faced by critics and internal contradictions in their own theoretical approaches. This panel today will hopefully give us ample opportunity to address those concerns. The questions that we formulated, that Tom Willis and I formulated, were passed around on the handout, so I'm not going to read them out. Just before we start, and the format will be, we'll have 12-minute initial remarks, then a shorter round of response, and then we will open the floor to debate. But before I hand over to our first speaker, is Elmar Fletcher. He is currently working on his PhD thesis on neo-Marxist and feminist state theory. He's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna and at the Technical University in Innsbruck. His research interests include critical theory, theories of the state, materialist feminist approaches, and philosophy of science. He is a member of the editorial board of the German journal Exit and is involved in various grassroots political activities. Second, we will have Alan Milkman, who has been active in Marxist theoretical and political work for over 40 years. He has published in political journals, especially Internationalist Perspective, as well as, for example, Rethinking Marxism and Historical Materialism. The focus of his theoretical interests have been the history of the communist, the small c communist left, and anti-Stalinism, and especially developing the implications of the publication of the manuscripts for Marxist critique of political economy, Wertkritik, and the theoretical vistas opened up by communization theory. Finally, our last speaker, Jamie Merchant, is a doctoral student in rhetoric at Northwestern and a member of the Chicago IWW. In the past, he has worked closely with other graduate students at Northwestern to form the Northwestern Graduate Collective, a nascent organizing community for graduate employees at the university. His writings are mainly to be found on permanent crisis, and his political interests lie primarily in restoring the possibility for a viable left politics in the US, for which he thinks a certain rapprochement between anarchism and Marxism may potentially play an important role. And with this, I'll hand over to Alan.
Okay, thank you. Is there maybe a chance to open the windows or something like that? Because the air
Sorry.
is really bad. Skyscraper, okay, shit. Well, anyway, I will not be able to answer all of the questions, so if you have certain preferences, you may say. I will start with the first one, what characterizes the value critique. Value critique, or rather as I would say, the critique of value direction, after the development of the Abspaltung theory by Platypus is an essentially theoretical position, trying to understand and critique the fundamental mechanisms that govern modern society. It differs from all the readings, as probably a lot of you know, insofar as the esoteric reading of Marx is preferred or endorsed. So it isn't the political Marx of class struggle and the workers' movement that it is interested in, but more the philosophical sides of his work, which focus on the abstract and fetishized character of modern domination. In this, it urges to keep the abstract critical theory of society strictly separated from the always fallible and more contradictory practical attempts to overcome. So Marxism shouldn't be understood as an identity-giving wholesale package position, which historically proved to be erroneous, I would say, but should be reduced to a theoretical core, which can help us to understand by a negative critique society, but not necessarily leads us to the ways out of it. The second question: what concrete ramifications does the call for the abolition of value have for Marxist politics? I would say no immediate positive ones. There is no new program, no master plan for emancipation that can be developed out of the abolition of value, out of the value critique program as a critique of society. So it can be said it is a general condition of emancipation that the value, and with it the abstract system of oppression stands for, is overcome. But how this is to be done is on a different story, a lot more complex story. What can maybe be learned from the new advancement is that a lot of things won't work. Not very much of what the old left proposed as Marxist politics. We should probably abandon a lot of that, because essentially abstract domination can be abolished by imposing some kind of direct personal domination. Also, if we are to critique the abstractions of the economic forms, we similarly have to target the political form itself. I mean, Marx had that, and Engels too, with the thing of the state dying away eventually, but I think we have to be a lot more radical. Emancipation ultimately has to mean abolishing the political form as well. And this is contradictory in the present situation, but we have to try to not postpone that till after the revolution. So we have to begin with that too, and kind of like see the constraints and the fetishizations immanent to the political form as something we want to get rid of already now, just as much as we want to get rid of the economic categories or their oppressive character. So, should I go on with the third one, or is there any preference to which you would want to have answered? We can make it short. I can just
Whatever you have.
okay. Then I will go on to just comment the third one, the question concerning Backhaus and the new Marx reading. I would say, first of all, Backhaus was more of a philosopher and a philologist than an economist. His aim was not to criticize only economy or the economic ideologies, but he sought to uncover a deep core in Marx that, in line with Adorno's reading, and as a student of Adorno, questions the whole historical formations, which is so the capitalism. Unfortunately, he didn't get very far in that, but I think the program was set in a way. And that is also where value critique, where the reaction critique departed and tried to enlarge in that vision. In that the 1970s certainly were a turning point in both left theory and praxis, because it was ultimately acknowledged that the old economicist and politicist roads to revolution cannot work out, actually could never have worked out. So the reformulation of theory, which in many ways builds on the earlier work of Frankfurt School, corresponds to new forms of praxis that react on the fact that everything was now a little more complex. Not one vanguard party, but many situated politics, not one system of oppression that covers all, but an abstract notion of, that English they had, reified relations that realize themselves in manifold ways through the life of everyday world, like that. Not only a positively stipulated strategy to revolution, but more of a negatively graspable, contradictory relations, which we have to belabor just wherever we meet them. So, parts of the impasse that the left finds itself in today were therefore necessary, I would say, value critique would say. Necessary as they stood for broadening of perspectives, which made things more difficult, but ultimately also more complete in a way. Anyways, corresponding to social reality and to the complexity of oppression that we face in social reality. Certainly, pondering on this doesn't kind of resolve the problem the left faces today. That is, its character of not being important. But in turn, just because you face this problem, asking for a kind of simple solution, a program solution, wouldn't get that right. It would actually mean setting the wrong questions on the agenda again, which proved to be wrong before. So what Backhaus and others should have taught us is that emancipation from the currently prevailing system of abstract oppression is immensely complex, and also probably, I would say, it isn't probable, it isn't something that we can really expect, but that it is still possible only if we face the complexity and contradictoriness involved with it. So no programs, no maybe utopias as well, but a hard laboring through these contradictions that we face in struggles wherever they occur. Fourth question was centered on anarchism. Is value critique proposing a return to anarchism? Well, for once, I think it is dangerous to work with old labels which do not conform to reality anymore. You cannot just take political designations that maybe were applicable for the 19th and early 20th century, in this war between anarchist and Marxist positions, and apply them to social movements which we have today. I mean, for sure, there are certain questions in this dispute that still are relevant, but today's leftist landscape is in many ways not reducible to a simple opposition between anarchist and Marxist. Situationists were probably the first who combined essentially Marxist critique with a kind of spontaneous and anti-authoritarian, maybe anarchist approach to many things. The problem is, you would have to define what anarchism and Marxism means for you and means in the specific social relations that both are embedded in now. And that is all but easy. I think that would be a task for a whole conference. So also like the theme of referring to the left, I think that is probably even more difficult. What is the left today? I think it's hard to say what the left really means. So the question is, can we refer to that, or should we even use those labels in a meaningful sense, or not more like something empty, which is to be filled, which maybe makes sense in a way, but makes sense, but it is not something we can like make a program out of. So I would say that the social relations are different, and in many ways Marxist and anarchist approaches intersect in social movements today. And I think from the perspective of the redemption critique, it can also be seen to be progressive insofar as one core contradiction that arises from anticipatory projects is dealt with more comprehensively, I would say, and that is the one between immanence and transcendence. I would say that see this also its complexity as somewhat of a double dialectic that you have. On the one hand, what is termed anarchist tended to be to strive for an immediate transcendence in its praxis at the cost of remaining immanentist, you could say, in the complexity of its theoretical vision that wasn't going really beyond. On the other hand, you can say Marxist approaches agree to remain immanent in the forms of its political praxis, and well, at least some of them retain the theoretical vision that went beyond the given immanent categories and try to really account for the complexity of transcendence in a meaningful way. So it might be good that this dialectic which we still face in many ways, is not anymore split into stark dualisms, but comes together in some ways, at least in the more progressive parts of the social movements. Do we have time for one more? 1 more minute, okay. Not really enough to start. Okay, maybe the sixth question, that is easy. In what way is this aspect, what was it, the science of value, determined and limited by the contemporary potential for revolutionary change that the societal whole progressism belongs to? I would say that concerning the social revolutionary aspect of the value critique, there are simply none. It's not the task of abstract critique of society to give you immediate programmatic notions of social revolution. It seeks to develop a most radical critique of society, but that is in no way tied to an equally elaborated notion of revolution. I think that's very important to acknowledge that. And that was also one big problem of the older approaches, that this package deal mentality. Okay, we have to cram it all into one program, and that essentially was politicist in the end, proved to be, at least with Lenin and all the Marxist traditions. Yeah. So this is not the job of abstract critique of society as value direction critique sees it, but that would be the job of for more concrete and concrete theories of praxis and immanent political theories. But that is something different from the abstract level of theory of society, and certainly a lot more complex and difficult. And well, you have to keep those separate. Okay.
Yeah, I guess my approach is somewhat different from Elmar's, even my take on what Wertkritik is. Several comrades have mentioned after I've spoken, isn't this all about philology? And aren't you just doing text critique? And isn't it all academic? I think quite the contrary. It is the reverse of academicism, or even pure text critique, or philology. I think what Wertkritik has stimulated and made possible is the rescue of texts of Marx that we wouldn't have known had it not been for a number of theorists who began to look into Marx's manuscripts, this division between the political and Wertkritik seems to me to be dubious. The figure I take as a good example of the union of the two is someone like Hans-Jürgen Krahl, who was active in the 60s and died in an auto crash. One can never know what his evolution would have been had he not died so young, but we can know what he wrote at the time, and it certainly showed a great interest in Marx's manuscripts, but it wasn't a philological interest, it was a political interest, and it's the union of the two that I find so interesting in the issues raised by Wertkritik. I mean, imagine what kind of Marxism we would have if no one had ever published the Paris manuscripts of 1844. Now, it's true that Lukács could argue that his inquiry into reification already laid out much, and alienation, already laid out much that was in those manuscripts. But our understanding of the relation between Marx and Hegel, our understanding of alienation, reification, has certainly been enriched. How much weaker would our understanding of capitalism have been if Marx's elaboration on capitalism, moving contradiction in the Grundrisse had never been accessible because the manuscript would have never been published. It seems to me that these texts of Marx with which Wertkritik is engaged are crucial for precisely a political orientation to capitalism in this epoch. So that's one way I would respond to question number one. Question number 5. I'm skipping around because I have limited time. Is the working class movement the pacemaker of capitalism, enforcing the last stages of reification that the bourgeoisie could not? It depends on what you mean by the working class movement. I wouldn't use that term, but if you mean have the mass political parties, social democratic or Stalinist, become the enforcers of capital in several countries over the course of the last 60 or 70 years, beginning in August 1914, continuing through the 1930s and the Reconstruction in the 1950s, and the whole epoch of Stalinism, then yes, they have been. But is that the working class movement? No, that is the political force that crushed the working class movement. That's not the workers' movement, that's the death of the workers' movement in that period. So I would have to nuance the end, but certainly that movement did things that the classical bourgeoisie could never have done and did not do. And will it return again in the midst of the present crisis if neoliberalism is as bankrupt as many of us believe it is? I don't rule out that possibility. And would it come in the same clothes, in the same garb? Probably not. But many of the same ideas, including nationalization, statification, would, I think, be a last rampart of capitalism. Cautious point that you raise in question number 6, Gregor. It does value critique, or a science of value. I'm weary of a word like the Wissenschaft von Wert. I have my own suspicions of science, so I don't want to create a science of value that models itself on modern science. But does it have a social revolutionary aspect to it? I think the point I just made is that it does, because it allows us to see that capital in this epoch is different from capital in prior epochs. It allows us to see the trajectory of capitalism that, in a sense, Marx anticipated, though he couldn't foresee its details, but that he anticipated, namely the shift from the idea that communism is about the distribution of wealth, or the redistribution of wealth, or equality in the distribution of wealth, but that what it is really about is the transformation of the production of wealth. and that unless you transform, overturn, abolish the production relations based on the value form, on wage labor, you have not struck a blow against capitalism. In fact, you are probably only reinforcing capitalism. Capitalism lives or dies on the basis of the value form, and that is exactly what Wertkritik tries to show us. So much of the political program of the classical left, of progressives, is predicated on redistributing income or regulating the bourgeoisie, and not on the abolition of wage labor and the abolition of value. And the argument that internationalist perspective makes is precisely that unless one moves directly to the task of the abolition of value, creating a revolutionary movement, participating in a revolutionary movement, is impossible today. It's not the task of Marxist revolutionaries to create the movement, but this understanding of the possibilities of the abolition of the value form and what it means if we do not directly attack the value form is something that is accessible to the working class, however different it is today than it was 100 years ago. So, question number 7. Without revolution, socialism cannot be made possible. I won't speak for every Wertkritiker, but I will speak for the group that I'm representing, internationalist perspective. Definitely, without a revolution, the overthrow of the value form is just an academic exercise, or a dream, or an illusion. It has to be concretized in the overthrow of the value form, and the protector of the value form, the guarantor of the value form in this epoch is the capitalist state. Whatever the garb it dresses itself in, because I certainly don't want to be misunderstood. Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is the capitalist state today. Ahmadinejad in Iran is the capitalist state today. Bashar al-Assad is the capitalist state today, and if he is replaced by a Sunni dictatorship, it will be the capitalist state today. If the Social Democrats win the next election in Germany, they will be the capitalist state today. And when Barack Obama won the last election, he became the representative of capital in Washington today. And therefore the mortal enemy of not simply the working class, however you want to define it, but of humankind. It seems to me that that recognition is closely connected to value form theory and Wertkritik. And unless that link is made, we can talk all we want about redistributing income and regulating the banks, or nationalizing the banks, or seizing the means of production through the state or through cooperatives. I mean, I frankly, since I have 2 minutes, I am tired of hearing Rick Wolff tell us that what we need are cooperatives. I mean, I'm not going to claim that I was alive in the 19th century when Saint-Simon or Fourier were making their claims, but all Rick Wolff is doing is giving us back what these utopian socialists said 150 years ago.
Without the seas turning to lemonade.
Definitely without play, because at least Rick Wolff is not so bold as to claim that it's play. Not that I would advocate that those who see communism as simply play or Woodstock on a grand scale. But nonetheless, the idea that we can respond to the crisis we're in now with cooperatives. I mean, workers did that at LIP in the 1970s. I mean, all you do with worker cooperatives is have to compete on the world market, the same as any other capitalist enterprise. It changes nothing, and it's the understanding of how dramatic and revolutionary the change has to be that I think is the contribution of Wertkritik.
Okay. So, I'm not nearly as well versed in value critique as either of these two gentlemen, but I do have some schematic and largely negative comments to say just about, I just focused on one of the questions, and that's the question about the abolition of value and its relation to concrete politics.
In the 1970s and 80s, an important reinterpretation of Marx's critical theory of society began to emerge that cut directly against long-standing and ideologically entrenched modes of reading Marx. Though this reinterpretation emerged in a variety of places and at different times, its general form consisted of a reconceptualization of Marx's key theoretical categories, such as labor and value, that removed the affirmative, trans-historical characteristics they retained for orthodox Marxism, transformed them into critical, historically dynamic categories. As Marx indicates in the Grundrisse and is highlighted by Stone, Marx's categories denote not positive economic phenomena, but rather the fundamental forms of human practice, Daseinsformen or Existenzbestimmungen, the determinations of existence that constitute the capitalist social formation. Rather than conceiving in the orthodox manner labor as an eternally mutable property of human existence that is the ultimate source of value and the standpoint of the critique of capitalism, in this view labor is grasped as a historically specific form of human practice that actually has the misfortune, as Marx puts it in Capital, of producing value. The ineluctable abstraction of human labor under the capitalist production of commodities, that's to say its role within the valorization processes of capital, produces value as abstract homogeneous labor time, and it is the blind, relentless drive to accumulate this surplus value, regardless or at the expense of human life itself, that forms the peculiar form of wealth at the core of capitalist modernity. As such, far from constituting the standpoint of critique, value-producing labor itself must be seen as the object of critique in any critical theory directed at the social conditions and forms of domination that constitute the modern world. The production of value through the expenditure of human labor time is the determining form of wealth for modernity, but it is not the only form of wealth for Marx. In the Grundrisse, again, Marx argues that, quote, to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agency set in motion during labor time, which depends on the general state of science and on the progress of technology, or the application of this science to production. Real wealth manifests itself in the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and its product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor reduced to a pure abstraction and the power of the production process it superintends, end quote. Interpreting this passage, Stone suggests that Marx contrasts value, a form of wealth bound to human labor time expenditure, to the gigantic wealth-producing potential of modern science and technology. This is the quotation from the portions that were circulated. Value becomes anachronistic in terms of the system of production to which it gives rise. The realization of that potential would entail the abolition of value. Thus, in this view, what both Marx and Stone refer to as real wealth is in fact pure potentiality. It is the possibility of a form of production in which the tremendous collective productive powers of society will no longer work to devalue necessary labor time in order to produce surplus labor time, but instead abolishes surplus labor to core, so that the general necessary labor time for everyone across society is reduced to a minimum. This is a possibility that is immanent to capitalism as a contradictory, historically dynamic social totality, as Marx argues in the Grundrisse quote. Capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. Hence it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in its superfluous form. Forces of production and social relations appear to capital as mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material conditions to blow this foundation sky high, end quote. Thus, the abolition of value means the determinate negation of capitalism. It would mean the realization of the potential for the real collective wealth of humanity to greatly reduce across the board the required time and intensity of work for everyone everywhere. It would be to sever the structural links between the total productive power of society and the driving destructive imperatives of the capital form, which is to say it would abolish the central constitutive contradiction of modern society and open the path to a fundamentally new and unprecedented organization and experience of social life. It would effect, in other words, a radical break with society as we know it. Such a radical break is itself only possible, however, because the abolition of value implies the abolition of the totality that is constructed around it. The totality of capitalism as a structure of alienation or self-generated self-domination, constituted through value, labor, and capital as social forms of practice. These considerations have certain implications for politics. To put it in classic fashion, it follows from what has been said that theory, broadly speaking, must again come to play some role, however mediated, in the formation and guidance of practice. For any politics that remains unaware of or ignores the agency of the value form, or how the drive for the production of surplus value motivates the historical dynamic of capital, or of how abstract labor as the substance of value mediates social relations, misses the core logic of the capitalist social formation, and so risks an unwitting perpetuation or affirmation of it. This seems to suggest the indispensability of grounding practice in the critical theory of society. On the other hand, as long as the practices constituting proletarian labor and the production of value persist, then capitalism continues to reproduce itself as a structure of domination, regardless of whatever subjective ideas are entertained by the producers themselves. On the left, this basically means that capitalism could care less whether we call ourselves Marxists, anarchists, socialists, or whatever. From the point of view of our entanglement in the circuits of value-producing labor, within the universal social forms that mediate capitalism as a total, quasi-objective historical context, whatever political ideology we think we owe our allegiance to is entirely beside the point. The imperatives of the totality define what is necessary regardless. Conversely, a given social movement of sufficient scope would not have to explicitly identify itself with Marxism per se, or with any other ideological label, to potentially bring the totality into some kind of focus. Of course, Marxist currents can play an important role of self-clarification within the context of a given movement, but ultimately this itself will only be possible in a situation where the material conditions are in place for a general social consciousness that can take something like the totality for its object. In other words, at this historical moment, a form of politics that somehow comes to be mediated or informed by the critique of value will have no a priori ideological identity. The question of the adequacy of a given social movement or form of collective critical consciousness to the problems posed by the deep structures of capitalism should always be posed not abstractly, but in close relation to the historical conjuncture in which we find ourselves. Such a question is not answered by looking to see what ideological affiliation some movement or organization may officially proclaim, if any, but by considering whether any such ideological content in tandem with the form of the movement seems in some way to point beyond the present historical context. It is then to see whether critical forms of collective consciousness, which emerge as part of an evolving contradictory historical totality, are able to see that totality in however mediated a form, and somehow absorb that vision into an organizational practice. If the abolition of value tout court means the accession to a truly post-capitalist organization of society, then there is also a vital temporal dimension that must be taken into account when considering the possibilities for value-critical radical politics. Specifically, we must considerably broaden our temporal perspective. As we are all aware, neoliberal capitalism has in many ways decimated the capacity to imagine in a common sense sort of way, or in any way really, society as a total form, much less to envision the supersession of capitalism itself. This has not always been the case. Though it was of course not without its own contradictions, the Fordist state capitalism of Western social democracy presented a different scenario. The state-mediated organization of capital accumulation along national lines, the closely interwoven nexus of capital, labor, and the state, and the apparent pacification of the class war between capital and labor, however temporary and illusory, provided a material foundation for the mass perception of something like society, of a social whole that is greater than the sum of its original parts. The international reorganization of accumulation on a highly abstract level and its ascension beyond national borders into the arcane, opaque world of financial capital is a hallmark of neoliberal society and a material precondition for its pervasive ethos of unfettered individual choice, as well as for academic fixations upon subjectivity that come at the expense of repressing any rigorous historical inquiry into objectivity. As a political comportment, the abolition of value must take on a robustly materialist outlook. It is these political economic conditions fundamental to the production of neoliberal subjectivity as well as its objective social structures that must be targeted for transformation by any critical politics. Such a transformation would not constitute the endpoint of political struggle, but rather an accession to a penultimate formation of capitalism on terms favorable to the left that would make overthrowing it once again appear possible, plausible, and desirable to great numbers of people. Though it doubtless seems utopian in this historical moment, this nevertheless implies that any such politics faces the task of recovering some kind of workable internationalism. This may sound like putting the cart before the horse in a country that hasn't had a functional left in any form for at least a half century at least. But this fact does not change the equally important fact that any truly anti-capitalist politics worthy of the name will be dead in the water if it remains limited to the horizon of the nation state. Value theory imposes this conclusion upon us. Inasmuch as value understood as socially necessary labor time is a category of the totality, it is a manifestly global category. Socially necessary labor time denotes the value of the labor of the collective worker in toto. That is, of the global proletariat at a given historical moment in the trajectory of capitalism as a world system. Therefore, if we accept the argument that the abolition of value and the realization of real wealth would be the determinate negation of capitalism, then the politics that takes that as its goal must necessarily operate in some kind of internationalist frame. The abolition of value must be the abolition of all value, the determinate negation of the totality formed by value-producing labor. It sounds daunting, but presumably none of us became socialists or leftists because we thought this would be easy. Finally, a value-critical politics would be based on a thoroughly sober assessment of what the current historical conjuncture looks like, along with its attendant horizon of possibilities or lack thereof. Right now, we are facing a rapid retrenchment of neoliberal financial power across the advanced capitalist bloc in a way that is destroying the lives of more and more people every day, and is coalescing in the formation of an austerity state, a long-term mutation of the neoliberal state that has emerged from the massive financial collapse of 2008 and the ensuing global slump. Broadly speaking, the enormous public bailouts of the self-destructing financial system across the capitalist West have created a situation in which the state, ironically, is now more severely mortgaged to international capital and financial markets than it was before. Sovereign debt and government bonds, one of the only remaining sources of finance after neoliberalism's exemption of corporations and the richest strata from taxation, must maintain their prices at a certain level to keep creditors on the world market satisfied. A major requirement for this is greatly reducing the amount of social product directed towards public goods and greatly increasing that which goes toward debt service, which we're all familiar with this program. At the same time, the economic crash destroyed and continues to destroy a great deal of value, as the general unemployment rate of the advanced capitalist world appears to have shot up with no significant reduction to pre-crisis levels anywhere in sight. The creation of a massive reserve army of labor, in tandem with the permanent fiscal crisis of the state, means this formation is here to stay for the foreseeable future. It is upon this inhospitable terrain that the left must somehow learn to organize itself if it is to have any future. Additionally, given what appears to be an increasing probability of either a major ecological catastrophe or a revival of imperial geopolitics, it is probably not an exaggeration to say that the left must learn to organize itself if society is to have any future. But because the left at this moment is not, because at least in the US, there is no organizationally coherent leftist project with a true mass base of support, though there are places we could look at and see sort of vague stirrings in this direction, of course. We're not even in a place to adopt Gramsci's classic metaphor, it seems to me, of the war of position to inform our thinking during this period, which I would argue first requires some actual forces which can then be positioned strategically. This is not to proclaim defeat, but merely to try to clarify our current situation and clearly indicate what we are up against. As always, there are tentative stirrings, grumblings, and more or less inchoate antagonisms towards the current form of society everywhere. Negativity will exist as long as capitalist society and all its internal and manifest contradictions exists. It is imminent to it. Thus, it is up to leftists and progressives to channel that negativity in a direction that would implicate capital and bring it into perspective as an impersonal system of domination whose abolition would benefit everyone rather than specific social groups, and further to do so before any such negativity is turned toward darker right-wing trajectories. It may then be appropriate to close with another quotation from Gramsci that, while it's not a pithy metaphor, it sums up our situation well. Gramsci states that a crisis occurs sometimes lasting for decades. This exceptional duration means that incurable structural contradictions have revealed themselves, and that despite this, the political forces, which are struggling to conserve and defend the existing structure itself, are making every effort to cure them within certain limits and to overcome them. These incessant and persistent efforts, since no social formation will concede that it has been superseded, form the terrain of the conjunctural, and it is upon this terrain that the opposition organizes. Or as Marx might have put it rather more concisely, hic Rhodus exultet.
Thank you. We'll have a round of responses by each panelist for around 2 minutes, and after that, you'll open the floor. And I'll just go all postmodernist and claim the space for 10 more minutes than the program says because we started a little late. So,
Okay, 2 minutes, not much, but I will try to respond to both of you. First, Alan, the accusation of being philological. I think not bringing together the political with the theory doesn't necessarily mean being academic or being philological, reducing theory to that. Actually, Wertkritik differs in this respect from the Neue Marktlektüre, from people like Marx, and Panelist, which are all academics and which just do their theory. There is very specific theory, also in kind of a disciplined way, while Wertkritik always tried to establish something of a theory production outside of academia, close to social movements, but still in the process of working through the contradictions of these actual movements, found out that the praxis of theory production has to have its own place and shouldn't be intermingled with the political. And that also brings us to the second point already, the working class struggle. Is it immanently linked via the critique of society with the political, or is it that the only political vision, or that the major political subjectivity that we are to look for? And Wertkritik clearly says no, it isn't. It's just not there. And maybe it was at some point in development of capitalism, but now it isn't a privileged subject of emancipation anymore. So in this, as you said, only because class logically develops out of the value relation doesn't mean that it is kind of leverage of abolishing it. So there is no immanent connection between this, between the critique of value as abstract domination and class struggle. This cannot be done. I think also history shows that it isn't applicable anymore in this way. So the overthrow of the value form can't be thought of as necessarily being something that has to do with class struggle. It has to do with a lot of struggle, but it has to go also through class struggle, which certainly is one immanent form of struggle in capitalism, but not the only one. But then again, maybe to answer to Jamie, the abolition of value can also not be understood as something that is immanently connected with the economic, as understood as a tautological, automatic kind of system, especially as it's headed in the Krisis theory. So with your what you proposed, I kind of had the impression that it's enough to just see the crisis developing and to just sit by and and then wait till the decay goes on, and then well, it kind of has to happen. So just sitting by it and seeing and watching what happens, it's definitely not enough, and especially not if it is again reduced, if abstract domination is reduced to an economist version of it. And this, I want to highlight again that by the Ramchin critique, it was established in the 1990s and also held by Robert Kurz and many important value critique authors. Points to the importance of this other side of domination, this patriarchal side of domination, which is not only important for subject formation, which is quite obvious certainly, but which can be seen to inform totality as such. So,
I will really be brief. I agree with a lot of what was said by the two panelists. So I'll focus on just one issue, and you may be right about the distinction between the new reading of Marx and who is engaged in that versus the value critique, but they are closely related, it seems to me, since the new reading of Marx is precisely about reading those manuscripts that we did not have access to until recently. But it seems to me there is a tendency in the Wertkritik that I've read to basically say that the working class can simply reproduce the value form within which it is subjugated, that its struggles are wholly contained within the value form. And I think that's a mistake, or at least that's not the way in which internationalist perspective would read the text of Wertkritik or the text of Marx. It seems to us, rather, that how one sees the working class has certainly been dramatically changed by the development and the trajectory of capital over the past century. But the fundamentals, namely that the collective worker or the Gesamtarbeiter is wage labor, is as true today as it was in 1857 or 1875. And that there is a way in which the collective worker alone has the capacity to explode the value form. It doesn't simply reproduce the value form, it does that too. There's no doubt about it. But it also, I believe, has the capacity to explode it. Because if it doesn't have the capacity to explode it, then what does? Where is there a social subject? Where are the social movements? Yeah, they can exist separated, a women's movement, a black movement, a Latino movement, a Muslim movement, a Zionist movement, a farm workers movement. We could go on ad infinitum. But what makes it possible for a subject to coalesce is that that subject is the collective worker. And it seems to me, if we don't grasp that fact, we disarm ourselves. So that would be the one point I would want to make here.
Yeah, and I'll be brief too. I guess I just wanted to clear up any misconception that I was arguing for, sort of like quietist or passive contemplation of the totality. I mean, I tried to make it clear that like people have to bring about the abolition of the totality, and that's a very daunting task. But that we also have to take into account that the way that the totality is also a historical formation that has a certain historical logic of its own, that has a certain pattern that unfolds within it. And so, I mean, it's just part of sort of reconciling that macro aspect of value critique with what forms of politics on the ground would be adequate to sort of opposing that in an effective way. Yeah, so I'm very much trying to foreground people have to bring this about, the system itself.
All right, thank you. Pam had her hands up first, and all right, just keep your hands up first while Pam is speaking. Or I think Pam and you in the front row were first, and all right.
Okay. I had specific questions for each of you, but I think that in continuation maybe of the workshop that Milchman from the IP presented from yesterday, one of the people in Platypus, Sunit, who's not in this room right now, raised the issue of the philosophy of history as an approach to the history of the left and what it means to deal with attempts at, we could put it in this way, attempts at overcoming the value form in the 20th century and previous moments, but specifically in the 20th century. Because just the way that you presented your presentation, it was as if these texts presented an intricacy, a complexity that otherwise couldn't have been grasped by revolutionaries prior to this moment, that there's a kind of necessary deepening. And it implies this corrective, at least from what I'm getting from the panelists, that there's a corrective of how difficult it actually was to challenge capitalism. And without really understanding, as Elmer put it, you said the immensely complex task of emancipation, without really getting it, well then is then revolution or attempts at revolution necessarily going to end up in failures? Because that's where the philosophy of history is at work. I think that's what Sunit was trying to say yesterday, that if we think that, I'm sorry, I'm being very wordy, I'll get to the point. If we think that the early 20th century revolutionaries were a failure because they didn't have access to this sort of deep critique of capitalism in which they're challenging the value form, I think that we're really missing something as to how the history of Marxism, Marxist politics, how do we use the history of Marxist politics for the present? I wanted to ask a very direct question of Jamie here. You said that this period, this issue of transition, you put it in terms of a penultimate formation of capitalism in a form more favorable to the left. And you said that it was, in a sense, bringing capitalism into a perspective as an abstract system of domination. So, in fact, it's something similar, I think, that Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha Program, in which he talks about like different stages in attempting to challenge bourgeois right and the value form. And I wanted to maybe just kind of expand on what you mean at this, because I know there's certainly differences between you and Milchman on this score. I think yesterday when the workshop was presented by the IP, there was this I think response against this idea of a transitional period. So if you could talk about that. And the last question for the first panelist, for Elmler, is what is the relationship, if there is a relationship, what is the relationship between a programmatic goal of the abolition of socially necessary labor time and doing away with the abstract domination of capital? What's the relationship between a programmatic goal, the programmatic goal of the abolition of socially necessary labor time, and this thing that you're calling the domination, the abstract domination of capital?
All right, that was a pretty long question, so I'll have the panelists respond directly, and then I'll take 3 questions I've got Unifront, Chris, and Danny as the next 3.
So who's first?
I guess Milchman, just the philosophy of history.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Don't misconstrue the failings of the presenter with the flaws of the ideas. Would be the first way. I may have presented them ineptly, but I think the idea that I was trying to articulate was sound. I don't know how we would have read Marx's manuscripts in the 1870s or the 1890s or even the 1920s. Probably, had we had access to them, it would have changed things, but more importantly, it seems to me, is the trajectory of capital itself. We can read Marx's manuscripts today in a way that we might not have been able to have read them when they were written, even if they had been made accessible. So that was a point I was making. I mean, just to take a concrete issue, personally, okay, maybe my own failing again. I don't think until fairly recently, and probably as a result of the financial crisis of 2008, but the role of fictitious capital and the role of the banking sector over the last 30 or 40 years. Until that time, I don't think I would have appreciated how critical Marx's analysis of money was. I think we can read Marx's analysis of money, and it is there in volume 1 too, but it's even clearer in some of these manuscripts how central money is, so that today I think we would have to acknowledge that even if the means of production were nationalized by the state, money would still play the singular role that it does in capitalism, because I can no longer envisage capitalism without money. That would be one example, okay? So what I'm basically arguing is not that history would have been different had we had access to these manuscripts, although Marx chose not to publish them. We could ask why, but it's not a question I'm interested in pursuing. We don't know what history would have been if those manuscripts had been available. My hunch is not very different from the way it was, but reading those manuscripts today, having full access to them, allows us to better grasp the trajectory of capitalism over the last century and prepare for the confrontation with it today.
Yeah, just quickly. The suggestion that we should maybe think transitionally is basically coming from what seems to be, to me at least, to be the reality that for the vast majority of the people who are being, everyone who's being screwed over by this global crisis and the onset of this global regime of austerity, a post-capitalist vision of society is very difficult to render plausible. or it seems implausible often enough to a lot of people because they're simply looking for a job. They need something to put food on the table. They need some form of viable income, and so you have people desperately fighting for Walmart jobs. And so we would have to think in terms of basically reforms for revolution is I think what I would want to argue. Like we would need to talk about how to reform the financial system in a certain way that makes investment possible for public projects that get more people back to work and that bring the level of structural unemployment down to a significant enough level where people can start to glimpse past the horizon of capitalism once again, which was once possible, but now is very, on a mass scale, is exceedingly rare. No.
Okay. If I got you wrong, right, you wanted to ask what programmatic aspects stem from the critique of value, and I would say this is a totally wrong question in the first place. This is a politicist question which value critique wants to attack because it is not a programmatic goal to abolish the value form.
Elmer, I'm sorry, that's not my question.
Okay.
My question was very simple. What is, if there is a relationship for you between the programmatic demand to abolish socially necessary labor time and there is no connection between the programmatic
this
goal?
this is not a programmatic demand. This is a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition of emancipation. This is on the level of totality. This is very abstract, and so you can't at that abstract level. The extension of the concept is very, very broad, and intention what it actually meant, what you can meaningfully get out of that is very small. So you have to have this as a necessary condition of emancipation, but this is way off the level of programmatic goals or anything like that. So programmatic goals need to climb down from this abstract necessary condition and start in the concrete complex. There you can have programmatic things, and these have to add up in a way and go together and change totality. And that is the difficult task because you can be wrong in every concrete situation with your program. But there is no program on the level of totality. That is very important. That will be the politicist illusion, and that will be something that we have to get rid of.
It sounds like you do have a concept of a relationship between the two. You're just saying
there,
what is the necessary condition.
There is a relationship, but that is
I have
like
plenty of questions on
very complex, stratified one, and so.
All right. Yeah. In front, and then Chris.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is just a very interesting panel, very Germano-centric or German-centric, whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, the only non-German mentioned was Stone, but perhaps he's a sort of honorary German, right? The fact is that particularly the early people that you mentioned, Backhaus, Reichelt, were very influential outside of Germany in some senses. I think quite a few ways, like Capital Class group in the UK, translated Reichelt in the 70s. Some of them went on to into this open Marxist thing, and some of them this Constant Sydney thing, and some of them this group called the International Symposium on Marxist Theory, right, including like Martha Campbell and Chris Arthur and Gib Reuten. And no one mentioned these people, and I just thought maybe it'd invite, if there's any relevant here to mention these people. One, I thought of two ways that they be contrasted with the German tradition that has been mentioned, right? So one way is just a philological way. The German, I think there's a kind of movement in the German tradition from a kind of reinterpretation, from a kind of a reconstruction of Marx towards a reinterpretation of Marx. And maybe the critic exit thing might be an exception to that, but generally speaking, Reichelt's project was one of reconstruction, Heinrich is one of more inverse reinterpretation. And you will see exactly the opposite in the international version of this kind of thing. Value form theory is sometimes referred to, right? So people like Diane Elson in the 70s, very much of the interpretation of Marx, and nowadays people like Chris Arthur and very, very much project of reconstructing, right? That's just on the sort of philological level about the logic, right? What is capital logic, what is the systematic dialectic? Then the other difference is, I guess, on the question of class, which is a very stark difference between the German and the international versions of these things, right? The German tradition tends to be very downplaying of class as an analytical category, as Marxist category. That you don't see that at all, I think, in the international version of these things, although politically they tend to be all over the place, right? No one's doing the same thing you see in Germany almost universally around downplaying the role of the class. Then the question was just a question about, I wanted you to talk about feminism and what you talked about as the value direction, which I just read as a kind of relevant sort of gender theme.
I guess the question that I had, it's sort of a twofold question. It has to do with the history of the workers' movement for socialism and not just Marxism as a form of appearance and as a mediation of capital. And I think that, Jamie, you mentioned Fordism as a way of concretizing the problem of capital that neoliberalism supposedly occults or renders more esoteric. And so what I wanted to put out there was that maybe Fordism, like the national state, right, because Fordism is really inseparable from nationalism, might have, in its own way, occulted and made more esoteric the issue of capitalism, or simply put. And as far as Elmar is concerned, you mentioned the workers privileging the workers as revolutionary subjects. It seems like an odd way of putting it. Like say that the working class would be privileged in some way as revolutionary subjects, especially because the in Marx's view, and certainly in the view of many Marxists, the condition of the proletariat is characterized entirely negatively. So in that respect, this idea of it being a kind of class ontology or privileged in some way seems to conflate an earlier history of Marxism with 20th century Stalinism, social democracy, a kind of workerism. And I guess what I was looking for then is maybe on both sides more of a responsiveness to what Alan was raising about, well, what other subject would there be? Right? In other words, what other form of mediation would there be for rendering concrete, manifesting, and thereby overcoming the self-overcoming of capitalism, or as Lenin put it, overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. It's one non-German I'll mention.
But he was a German agent, as we all know.
Sure, and in other contexts I would claim him as not a Russian, but in this context maybe,
It was a joke. Apparently, not well. But
Shall I start, or, the second question, I will start with that one. Revolutionary subject. I mean, certainly Marx had negative notion of class insofar as he saw it as being, in a way, immanent to capitalism in his logical approach, especially in the late writings in Capital. You have fewer mentions of the political class struggle in Capital. But, and that is actually what Wertkritik would refer to as well. But then again, you have already with Marx, and even more so with Engels, this political privileging, I would again say, of class as emancipatory actor. And there was simply there were no questions, no other questions of oppression, and hence no other emancipatory subjectivities. And so, if not class, what subject should it be today? I would say there is no one subject anymore, and that is what we can probably learn from this new left turn and also postmodern turn. Just because, I mean, we shouldn't take their critique, because their critique omits totality and things just does the same mistake the other way around, kind of. But just because there is totality out there and everything is connected doesn't mean that the subjectivity that is going to emancipate itself or the whole society in a way from this totality is in itself already predefined, is one already. So we have, again, to start at the complex level, and there we have manifold effects of oppression, and therefore also many subjectivities that build on these relations of oppression and build their identities on them also. And that's how you can probably define the subjects via their situated identities. And then you have to start building networks between those subjectivities and try to find something that brings them together and in some instant grows and comes to overthrow totality. That is, I mean, that is quite probably not much or rather abstract to say, but that's the only way to do it. And I think there's no program how to do that. There's no like one way, but you have to start from this concrete, complex level which we are facing. And the second question, you were mentioning the systematic dialectic. That's certainly interesting. Also, why there is such a different development in the English-speaking countries, why class still matters a lot more. I would say that relates to simply the way that workers' movement tradition developed there. And, but that doesn't necessarily relate to the real relevance of class in society. I would say this is class as the one privileged subject, or even class an sich, class in itself, and class for itself, doesn't go together there as well. It's just not feasible anymore. So we need that reinterpretation, I think. And concerning the gender dimension, that is, I mean, that's a long story, and I don't know how to make it short. But you can certainly start to try to grasp it when you go to these older materialist feminist approaches that were still developing in the workers' movement. What they essentially said is that the whole of production, the whole of like formally visible surface things that we see is only possible by a system of reproduction that is essentially gender-oriented, that is aligned with female values and female activities as well as housework for sure, but also emotional work and all those things that men usually don't do because they are out there and you know, they are the fighting subjects on the market and in the public sphere, and then you need these this other side to even make this this abstract working of capitalism possible. So and from that the critique was expanded and also taking into certain aspects of subject theory, psychoanalysis, and some postmodern approaches, and yeah. That was brought onto the level of totality, and to understand that this is actually, you can find that in quite a lot of contradictions in modern society. This is binary, which is essentially gender. Even if there is not real women or man involved, it's just it is a symbolic connotation that has to be taken into account if you want to get the way oppression works right.
Sure. Yeah, with respect to Chris's question. Yes, definitely. Fordism occulted capital in many ways. But, of course, I mean, not least of which because it was tied, you know, concretized, through, as you put it, through the nation state, you know, in the Cold War context, the global sort of perceived in that frame collectively. But nevertheless, I guess my point was just that it was a form of society in which the social whole did appear as, like, the idea of society was more of a currency that was more commonly available. I mean, you see this in like post-war social theory. It was perceived as a, you know, an alienating term often enough. You know, society versus the individual, and that kind of stuff obviously hasn't completely gone away. But you know, there's all this worry during the Fordist period about the individual being, you know, absorbed into the social whole, and you know, losing individualism is in crisis and stuff. It's the inversion of the logic of cultural logic, part of the cultural logic of neoliberalism now, right? Which is the, you know, very obviously very much valorizes the individual in just about every way. And so the point is just that different regimes of accumulation or different forms of society provide for different apprehensions of the social. That it appears in different mediated ways, and that right now, the way that neoliberalism works, with the way that it's sort of tethered historically to this international regime of finance capital for conditions for its accumulation, has led to these particular forms of subjectivity which make apprehending the social whole pretty difficult. So the idea, so that was my point basically, that different regimes of accumulation can lead to different perceptions of what society is, which could then possibly open up avenues for new forms of politics.
All right, so I've got in this direction on the list, Danny and Tom, Wentai, Richard, Ed, Jeremy, and James.
There's only two at the time.
And as we only have 20 minutes left, let's close the list after the last person. And I'll take maybe 3 questions depending on how long they are. Please ask them as concise as possible.
Okay, I'll try to be as possible. I'm really trying to find out what was found in the Granaries and 1844 manuscripts that really added to anything political that was not available in Marx's writings prior to this. I mean, there's already, in my opinion, tons of examples of him speaking of abolition of value. For example, in Volume 3, he critiques say as sort of being tautological because everything's already relative to value. There's points in Paris Commune where he already talks about abolishing proletarian labor. There's tons of examples. And to me, the sort of value critique seems to be more symptomatic of sort of Marxism becomes diluted, starts to be about this and that, and it appeared, and sort of this, I guess, return to Marx or this rereading of Marx is really what has always been, and I don't know, I'm just trying to find out what really big political, not that I'm against the Granaries, or, I espouse everything.
All right, Tom.
So I have 2 questions, relatively quick. First for Alan, and then for both Alan and Elmar. Specifically, Alan, you answered Pam's question, the sort of matter of Marxist texts, by saying that ultimately, it's not that we unearthed Marxist texts and now have this sort of ability to understand the value form, but rather that there have been some type of historical changes in capitalism that now allow us to sort of understand and unravel the value form in ways that we previously weren't. I just wanted to ask what you specifically think those changes are and what their character is and what type of, as Pam was getting at, theory of history this implies, because there would be many Marxists who would say, in fact, that these matters have become more opaque as time has gone on, and in fact have become much harder to understand today than then. And then I don't know if this has been sort of raised as much in the discussion here, but I know that both Alan and Elmar, there's emphasis in both your groups on the necessary immediacy of the abolition of the value form. And obviously carried to a logical extreme, this becomes just sort of like an impracticability. So how much and of what type of mediation is too much and becomes hamstrings an attempt to abolish value beyond capitalism?
I wanted to ask about the relationship between the abolition of value and the abolition of labor. And if it's such that the abolition of value is the abolition of labor, then how is this related to a question of, or sort of like the utopian demand of full employment? And then how is full employment related to the abolition of labor? Does the abolition of labor necessarily follow full employment? And in this context, sort of what is the role of politics here in creating those conditions? And I know that Jamie has sort of already talked about this, but I guess I'm still just confused about what makes neoliberalism particularly special, or opposing neoliberalism special and distinct from opposing capitalism.
Alan, would you like to begin?
Sure. Well, it seems to me the 2 questions that arose first really can be perhaps answered by the same response. Marx writes his critique of the Gotha Program. Why wasn't the abolition of labor part of the critique of the Gotha Program? Why, in the critique of the Gotha Program, did he preserved in the lowest stage of communism remuneration for the worker on the basis of labor time. I would argue that, yes, Marx certainly spoke of the abolition of labor before 1875. He spoke of it in the Paris manuscripts. He spoke of it in his critique of Friedrich List. It was there. And yet he came to write the critique of the Gotha Program, and it was not there. In fact, what was there was a long period of transition in which labor time accounting would be the basis of this stage of communism. Now, I guess one could argue that Marx thought it would be too radical to extend his critique that far. I guess you could argue that he very much wanted to see a unified social democratic party in Germany. We could speculate on a lot of things. But I think the trajectory of capital since the critique of the Gotha Program, and in particular over the course of the 20th century, has made it clear that that was a failing or a weakness, that that demand of Marx for a lower stage of communism predicated on labor time accounting is not the basis for even a transition to communism today. It's more a basis for the perpetuation of capitalism. At least that's the argument I would make. And I think we have to be willing to criticize texts like that just because they instantiate views that I think are completely outdated today, however relevant it may have seemed in 1875. And all I can say is I don't know how I would have reacted in 1875. I don't think you can leap over your own shadow. I don't think you can say with any authority what you would have said in a different historical epoch. But I know what I can say today based on the trajectory of capital over the last 100 years. And the critique of the Gotha Program is, I would argue, completely inadequate. Full employment. I don't see how a demand for full employment has anything to do with the abolition of labor. Because full employment is a demand for jobs. It seems to me to be predicated on the existence of labor, waged labor, not the overthrow of waged labor. I mean, I've talked to many people who believe in full employment. What they want is jobs in capitalist industry, in capitalist bureaus and offices. What they want is for the state to guarantee full employment, or at the very least a guaranteed annual wage if it can't be provided. That to me is the perpetuation, not the abolition of the value form.
Would you like to respond to the questions, or should we?
I would just bring up, I do disagree a bit with Alan on that. I think that there's a lot of different ways we can think about full employment as a demand, and one of which is not so much seeing it as just adding net jobs, but seeing it as a demand or a program organized around the idea or the possibility of making it easier for people not to work and not have to enter the labor market, and rather than seeing full employment as just adding, like a net adding of jobs, like seeing the project of full employment as like trying to organize around demands that will shrink the labor market, like like pensions, like Social Security, like organizing around the retirement age, things that people, if you ask the average person, would you like to retire 2 years earlier, like they'll probably say yes. Things that are possible like that, and that if it went through, if we were able to sort of organize something like full employment, and the guys at Jacobin are talking about this, as a lot of you are probably aware, there's been a lot of dialogue over there on that topic. We would just, the collective working class, the collective worker, would be in a much stronger position.